She was 83 years old. She had worked all her life. Her husband had died 6 years earlier, and since then, she had lived alone in the same apartment for 40 years. One Thursday afternoon, a man knocked on her door. His name was Marco, or at least that's what he said. He smiled. He was patient. He accepted her coffee. He asked her questions about her children, about the neighborhood where she grew up, about when the streets were different. And when he left 40 minutes later, he had in his pocket the 2,300 euros she had kept in an envelope under her mattress for months, her 2 gold rings, and her wedding band. She only realized it that night when she went to bed. She didn't call the police. She was too ashamed. Who is this man? How does he think? What did he see in her that you didn't? That is precisely what we will analyze today. The elderly predator doesn't choose his victims at random. He operates with a precise and ruthless predatory logic. In his mind, every social interaction is an evaluation. He observes, he calculates, he categorizes. The criteria he uses to identify his ideal target are the product of accumulated criminal experience. He looks for visible signs of vulnerability, someone walking slowly and hesitantly down the street, a house with an unkempt garden suggesting regular maintenance, an elderly person who responds with disproportionate enthusiasm to the slightest attention, a sign of extreme loneliness. He seeks out people who live alone and whose loved ones are conspicuously absent. Every sign he picks up refines his choice. This isn't intuition, it's a method, repeated and perfected. The central logic of this method is what criminologists call the risk-reward calculation. For the thief who preys on the elderly, this equation is extraordinarily favorable. On the reward side, savings accumulated over a lifetime, often kept in cash at home due to distrust of modern banks. Valuable gold jewelry, collectibles, and pensions deposited on a fixed and predictable date. On the risk side, reduced physical stamina, a statistically lower probability of filing a police report due to shame or fear of losing independence, and credibility sometimes undermined by institutional age-related biases. The criminal has taken all these variables into account. Their victim is not chosen at random. They are selected because they represent the best balance between what can be gained and what is risked. Subscribe to the channel now if you want to understand how these criminals operate and how to protect your loved ones. We publish in-depth analyses of criminal psychology every week. Click like to help this content reach those who need it. What makes this type of theft particularly sinister is not the cold logic of the calculation, but the deliberately feigned warmth that accompanies it. The most effective criminal in this category doesn't look like a criminal. They look exactly like what a lonely person needs most, an attentive, patient, and seemingly interested human presence. They sit, listen, ask about grandchildren, a missing spouse, years of work. They laugh at appropriate moments, express sympathy at appropriate moments. They mimic all the behaviors of genuine human connection with a precision that most people don't detect because they can't imagine that someone could simulate such precision with such coldness. What clinical psychology calls affective social engineering is the core technique of their operation. It works because it exploits a basic human need to feel seen, heard, and connected. To understand why this technique is so effective, especially for older adults, it's necessary to understand the clinical reality of chronic loneliness. Neuroscience has shown that prolonged social isolation affects the brain in measurable ways. It reduces activity in the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for critical evaluation and detecting manipulative intentions. It increases levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, keeping the nervous system in a state of chronic alertness that depletes available cognitive resources. And it dramatically amplifies the emotional value a person places on the few social interactions they have. For someone who goes days without a real conversation with another human being, an hour of attentive presence from a stranger can have extraordinary emotional weight. The isolated brain is hungry, and the predator arrives with exactly what that hungry brain needs in exchange for what it needs. Dehumanization is the psychological mechanism that allows this offender to operate without remorse. To maintain a cordial conversation, look an elderly person in the eye, accept their tea, and then empty their wallet or access their banking information. The human brain must erase the victim's humanity. The victim must cease to be a person in the offender's mental representation. They become a transaction, a target, an access point. This dehumanization process is not activated suddenly at the moment of the crime. It is built gradually over months or years of criminal practice and the reinforcement of internal narratives. Leave a comment now Have you ever noticed this type of manipulation attempt in your environment or in the environment of a loved one? What alerted you? Your story could help someone else recognize these signs in time. Technological advances have radically transformed this type of crime. The physical thief who used to ring doorbells posing as a plumber or real estate agent still exists. But today, they are joined by an army of cybercriminals operating remotely, using psychological scripts, specifically designed to exploit the cognitive vulnerabilities of older adults. These scripts are based on two main mechanisms: false urgency and false authority. False urgency is extraordinarily effective because the human brain, faced with a perceived emergency, temporarily deactivates critical thinking circuits and activates those for rapid response. The cybercriminal who calls saying, "Your grandson is in prison and urgently needs money," knows exactly the effect that message has on the brain of the older person listening. Panic creates an opportunity during which the victim is neurologically incapable of assessing the plausibility of the scenario. False authority works on the same principle. Someone who presents themselves as a police officer, bank employee, or public official triggers an automatic obedience reflex in the aging brain. The psychological profile of cybercriminals specializing in targeting the elderly reveals an additional characteristic: physical distance as a form of moral anesthesia. It is much easier to steal from someone when you can't see their face. When the victim is reduced to a voice on the phone or a name on a form, the brain's empathy mechanism is not activated with the same intensity as during a face-to-face interaction. This geographical and sensory distance significantly reduces what psychologists call the moral cost of the act. The criminal presses a button to empty a bank account. They don't see the elderly person who discovers the next day that their savings have vanished. And this invisibility of the human consequence allows them to repeat the act indefinitely. What is rarely discussed, because it touches on a deeply uncomfortable subject, is the lasting psychological impact on the victim beyond the financial loss. When an older person realizes they have been manipulated, the first emotion is usually not anger, but shame. A deep and debilitating shame that calls their own judgment into question. How could I not have noticed? This shame produces what clinical psychologists call double victimization. The first victimization is the crime itself. The second, often more devastating in the long run, is the loss of confidence in one's own judgment that shame brings about. And this second victimization has a serious practical consequence. It leads the victim to not report the crime, to absorb the loss in silence, to avoid facing the judgment of others. Share this content now with the older adults in your life and their caregivers. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our upcoming content. The entire cycle of these types of crimes can only be broken through action at multiple levels. At the individual level, the most effective prevention remains open and regular communication. Talk to your elderly relatives about the techniques these criminals use, but do so without being condescending. Establish simple family protocols. The rule of never transferring money over the phone without first consulting a family member. The habit of sharing suspicious contacts. At the systemic level, the underreporting of these crimes must be actively combated. Institutions must create spaces where elderly victims can report what they have experienced without feeling judged. And at the cultural level, we must treat the vulnerability of older people not as a personal problem to be managed, but as a collective responsibility. Every time a family leaves an elderly relative in prolonged isolation, it unwittingly creates the conditions that the criminal seeks. An elderly parent who speaks regularly with their children, who has neighbors who know them by name, who is part of an active community network, represents a much less attractive target for a predator than someone whose absence goes unnoticed for several days. Human connection is the most effective protection there is.